First of all, many thanks to the organizers for putting this conference together. I'm really happy to take part in the conference, and it's an amazing feeling to be physically surrounded with so many Marxist feminists. It feels like a bit of light in these dark times. So thank you so much, Andrea, for your paper, and you opened perfectly the question of body, I think. I will just move a little bit more to the questions of Rosa Luxemburg, and I will present something about her new discovered papers, and the title of my talk is Nobody Left Behind, Rosa Luxemburg on Gender, Labor and Colonial Violence. Just to introduce myself shortly, so I'm Ankica Čakardić, as you heard. I come from Yugoslavia. I'm an academic worker. I'm a communist and feminist. I think this is the basic bottom. So Rosa Luxemburg refused to leave anybody behind. Not women workers, not colonized peoples, not a single victim of capital's violence. We're living through an extraordinary moment in Luxembourg scholarship. Thousands of pages written in Polish, texts never translated in German, have been recently discovered in the archives. So in the next 20 minutes, 22 minutes, hopefully, a bit of breaking news. I'll walk you through some of these up until recently completely unknown writings by Rosa Luxemburg. I translated many of those pages from Polish, and I will try to present some of those newly discovered texts. What strikes me most is how powerfully these texts resonate to our present moment, particularly on questions of gender, labor, and colonial violence. Whether this kind of continuity is reassuring or troubling, I'll leave for you to decide. So Luxemburg's story, as you all know, begins in Warsaw, where she joined the revolutionary movement while still in high school. But as the repression intensified, she was forced into exile, leaving Warsaw for Zurich by the end of 1889. There she found herself among Polish and Russian revolutionaries who would shape the course of European and world socialism. Already in 1893, she co-founded Polish socialist magazine Sprawa Robotnicza with Leo Jogicis, Julian Marchlewski, and other students in exile. A year later, she took over as editor, writing under the pseudonym Kruszczyńska. It's exactly in these early Polish writings that we discover Luxemburg determined to leave nobody behind, attending to the specific conditions of women workers, the violence of colonial extraction, and the interconnections between forms of exploitation that her contemporaries too often overlooked. Luxemburg devoted her early writings in Sprawa Robotnicza to analyzing the concrete conditions of Polish workers. Between 1893 and 1894, she published 5 articles examining worker protection legislation. This series reveals both her sustained engagement with labor reform and her critical analysis of how protective legislation operated within the structural constraints of the capitalist system. Significantly, in addressing these questions of labor protection, she also deeply engaged with feminist concerns. These passages on women's working conditions can thus be situated within Luxemburg's broader feminist writings, which, though relatively few in number, and so far I discover only 5 texts written on feminist issues by Rosa Luxemburg, and they demonstrate that the question of women's emancipation were woven throughout her analysis of capitalism, labor struggles, and revolutionary politics. These published theoretical interventions, however, represent only part of Luxemburg's engagement with women's emancipation. She strongly championed the organizational efforts of the socialist women's movement, but primarily expressed this support through collaboration with her close friend Clara Zetkin. For instance, in a letter to Zetkin, she captures her enthusiasm for the women's movement and writes the following. So the quote, "Dearest Clarisse, when are you going to write me that big letter about the women's movement? In fact, I beg you for even one little letter." End of quote. So-called girl talks, quite similar to what probably many of us experienced in recent weeks while writing to each other about the upcoming conference in Porto. Some things never change. What unites both her published writings on feminist issues and her organizational support for women's emancipation is a consistent analytical framework. Throughout her feminist work, Luxemburg analyzes the position of proletarian women in the context of capitalist exploitation and oppression, while simultaneously criticizing bourgeois feminism for being elitist and lacking class inclusivity. She applies the same approach in her essay titled "Ladies and Women," published in Polish newspaper Gazeta Ludowa on June 16, 1904, where she writes the following with her typical irony. "The bourgeoisie loudly proclaims the principle of political equality between women and men and gallantly bows to these vocal ladies, fully aware that this entire women's movement is merely a plaything. With stern seriousness and disdainful smile, the conscious working class woman knows that as long as the bourgeoisie rules, women's political equality with men remains a dream." End of quote. This critique speaks directly to neoliberal feminism, carceral feminism, and leaning-in ideology, while the vast majority of the world's women remain trapped in exploitative labor conditions. When Silicon Valley promises empowerment through gig work apps, or when mainstream feminism celebrates the first woman CEO while ignoring the women's working poverty wages in her company's supply chain, we see precisely the dynamic Luxemburg identified. Bourgeois feminism is a plaything that leaves capitalist exploitation fundamentally intact. This critique of bourgeois feminism rested on Luxemburg's Marxist understanding of how capitalist formation structures both production and social reproduction as a totality, transforming human life itself into a commodity. We might read her development of this analysis as addressing the problem of the value form, especially when she notes that, quote, "The worker is but a part of capital, a part of the money he invested in his interest, a commodity he bought, labor power." End of quote. While Luxemburg herself obviously does not employ the terminology of fetishism of commodities or reification of Lukácsian type, her analysis here offers a rare instance of what we might understand today as the core logic of the value form. Labor power becomes commodified, valued not according to human need, but the abstract measure of socially necessary labor time required for the worker's reproduction, thereby reducing life itself to an object of capital's valorization process. From here, Luxemburg turns to a second Marxist feminist problem she addresses in the same essay, the feminization of labor. As women enter any given sector of labor market, wages in that field systematically decline. So she writes, "The reserve army of workers is steadily growing. The reason is that increasingly machines are coming into use that make it possible for women and children to replace the worker and thus to become a competition to him. Because the capitalist always has the option to hire others or to introduce machines, he can push exploitation to the highest possible level." This dynamic Luxemburg identified over 130 years ago operates with devastating precision today. Just look at the professions coded as women work: teaching, nursing, social work, childcare. Despite being socially essential, they remained systematically undervalued and underpaid. The COVID pandemic made this brutally visible when care workers, most of them women of color, were simultaneously declared essential and at the same time treated as disposable. The feminization of labor is further complicated by a third interconnected feminist issue Luxemburg examines in another Polish essay: the intersection of class exploitation and gender oppression. If capital exploits gender division of labor to cheapen labor power, it does so not in a vacuum, but within existing capitalist structures that render women vulnerable to both exploitation and workplace violence. Luxemburg writes the following: the capitalist has only one thought and one objective. He wants to extract as much strenuous labor from the worker as possible, whilst paying him as little as possible. So let's put women and children into factories too. Moreover, Luxemburg continues, he has the added convenience of women and children being far more vulnerable and submissive to his will, so that exploitation takes place far more easily and more brazenly without any of the resistance usually offered by abused male workers. End of quote. When we witness women garment workers in Bangladesh laboring under nominally protective legislations, yet facing deadly factory collapses like Rana Plaza, when domestic workers across the Gulf remain entirely excluded from labor law protections, working in conditions of near servitude, when migrant care workers in Europe and North America, or sex workers in general, face systematic abuse precisely because their precarious legal status renders them more vulnerable and submissive, we see Luxemburg's analysis confirmed across global capitalism. Such interlocking problems, the commodification of labor, the decline of wages through feminization of labor, the unitary process of capitalist exploitation and gender oppression, culminate in what Luxemburg describes as the fundamental violence inherent in capitalist relations themselves. Describing this problem, she writes the following: for every few hundred dead workers, the life of one capitalist is traded. For the capitalist to grow fat, strong, and burly, the worker becomes thick, weak, and miserable. The worker loses more lifeblood at work each day so that a capitalist can have more of it. The capitalist fattens himself on the lifeblood he sucks from the worker. End of quote. The fundamental violence Luxemburg identified in capitalist relation, capital fattening itself on the lifeblood of workers, and gender oppression, manifested with even more brutal intensity in the colonial periphery, where entire peoples faced not merely exploitation, but genocide. Throughout her writings in the Polish magazine Gazeta Ludowa, between January and June 1904, Luxemburg sought to inform Polish proletarians about the horrific violence unfolding in Germany's African colonies, a topic she would later develop more fully in her magnum opus, The Accumulation of Capital, and the Junius pamphlet. Embodying what we might call Marxist epistemic care, she wanted Polish workers to understand what was happening in the Southwest Africa and to extend their solidarity to African victims of German colonial oppression. Almost every issue from this period featured her reports on colonial resistance in Africa, especially the Nama and Herero's people struggle against German genocide. In doing so, Luxemburg exposed the colonial genocide in Namibia to a readership that desperately needed to confront this reality. In February 1904 issue of Gazeta Ludowa, under the rubric Colonial Atrocities, Luxemburg wrote that the forced labor imposed on African people in Congo meant nothing other than the actual slavery, as Europeans spread civilization through capital with looting, murder, and torture. Her analysis illuminates racial capitalism when we witness the hyper-exploitation of women workers in export processing zones across the global south today, sewing our clothes, assembling our electronics, growing our food, when indigenous women, land defenders in Canada, Brazil, and the Philippines face violence and assassination for resisting extractive industries, when black and migrant women remain systematically excluded from labor protection legislation in domestic work sectors worldwide, we see the same dynamic Luxemburg identified. Capital's parasitic relation to life itself, operating through intersecting structures of gender, race, and colonial domination. Luxemburg's vivid accounts of colonial violence in her Polish newspaper articles that I presented her here were not merely humanitarian reporting. They formed the empirical foundation for her theoretical analysis of imperialism. For instance, on April 24, 1904, she wrote the following.
5 minutes.
Exactly what I need. We are witnessing the trampling of ancient customs, the destruction of venerable civilization, the annihilation of fruits of millions' labor, and extermination of entire peoples, all for the profit of a band of capitalist parasites from Germany, France, England, Russia, Belgium, Italy, and the Netherlands. These leeches are not content with feeding off the blood and sweat of exploited workers in their own countries. They push forward, preceded by murderous soldiers across lands and seas to seize entire new worlds to devour whole peoples, and this is called colonial policy, end of quote. Where capitalism today, Luxemburg continues, clears the way through deserts, mountains, and oceans, we shall one day stand as a united humanity, sweeping away injustice and oppression from the river to the sea. Willist Luxemburg obviously didn't say the last and final part of this sentence I just shared with you. The parallels she enables us to draw are striking. The colonial genocide of the Herero and Nama people shares fundamental characteristics with ongoing forms of colonial violence today. When we witness Israeli settler colonial violence, genocide in Palestine, the systematic dispossession, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, the denial of water and medical care, the destruction of entire communities, we see the same logic of elimination Luxemburg documented in Namibia. When migrants, disproportionately women and children, die crossing the Mediterranean or the US-Mexico border, fleeing conditions often created by very capitalist extraction and imperial wars that Luxemburg analyzed, we witness capital's deadly indifference to racialized and colonized life. Those who survive the crossing face detention centers and prisons, another form of state violence that should be identified as continuous with colonial structures of elimination and control. Luxemburg's Marxist-feminist methodology refuses any politics that would defer one liberation struggle for the sake of another, insisting instead of the material interconnection of all forms of capitalist exploitation and oppression. Her work challenges us to build movements capable of confronting capitalism as a totality. And to circle back to the title of this presentation and to conclude, nobody left behind. This is Luxemburg's insistence that the liberation of women workers, the freedom of colonized peoples, and the emancipation of the working class in general are not separate struggles to be pursued sequentially, but materially bound dimensions of a single unitary revolutionary project. When we are told today that fighting for reproductive rights is a distraction from class struggle, or that trans-liberation must wait until after the revolution, or that addressing the question of sexuality or question of sexual violence within our movements is a divisive, we are hearing the same logic Luxemburg rejected. It is actually the recognition that capitalism exploits and abandons bodies everywhere, and that our response must be equally comprehensive. Isn't that exactly the program of Marxist feminism we're building today? Read Rosa Luxemburg not as a lesson from history, but as a call to action for today. Thank you.